And we're back, and with me is Evan Todd. Evan, I know this isn't your first rodeo. You've been doing this for a while now, talking about this. But you walked out of Columbine High School 19 years ago. So you're one of the survivors.
I am.
And I know you've told this story 1,000 times, but before we get into the broader topic of armed staff, can you tell the story of what happened to you inside the school.
Yeah, on April 20th, 1999, I was the first student who was shot in the library. And after everything that happened in the library, I was the last student to talk to the two murderers out of killing me as they held guns to my head. And I was also the last one to talk to them before they committed suicide.
Wow, that's pretty heavy. But here's the interesting part of this, is that unlike the dominant narrative today that the answer to this is gun control, almost from, you said since you were 16, you've actually been out doing the opposite, which is talking about your experience and then saying, hey, wait a minute, what if there'd been a teacher or a janitor or an administrator who was armed that day? What might have been different? So you're actually out there advocating for armed school staff.
Absolutely. Even from the beginning, you know, there was a few months where I didn't know whether I did question the topic, whether guns were the problem or the solution, and I think school staff would have changed the outcome of Columbine if they were armed. You know, not all of them, nobody should be forced, but if they had the ability and training, I think that would have changed things dramatically.
Things are a little different today, but the school school shootings are still happening, and the mass casualty events are still happening. But in terms of the ability of survivors to go out and tell their story, and by the way, it's important for these kids to be able to tell their stories, because their stories matter no matter where they fall on this debate we're having with regard to guns. But it's very different now that you had to actually go out and try and talk to 2 or 3 people at a time. You said you talked to the Boy Scouts, you talked to small groups. So you would have to go out and try and, if a TV station wanted to offer you airtime, great, you could tell your story. Or if a newspaper wanted to interview you, you could tell your story. Today, though, you can just have a couple 100,000 Twitter followers and tell your story, and that's actually what's happening. How does that, I mean, how different do you think things would have been if you and maybe one of the other survivors of Columbine, who's, by the way, it's interesting that you're not the only one. I'm not. We both know Patrick Neville, state representative, who was there that day, and he's very much pro-gun. How different might the narrative be today if guys like you had that kind of platform from the beginning?
You know, it's tough to say where the road of history would have led, but I don't think. I think that if there might not be a narrative now. I think it would have prevented many school shootings that have happened, and I think it would have saved countless lives. So things would have been different had the narrative gone differently, and some of us had a voice like some of the kids and other advocates have these days.
Okay. Something interesting going on these days that I notice, and something has changed with regard to this debate, and I think Parkland was probably really changed things a lot. Terrible tragedy. But what you saw is mass walkouts by students around the country, right, in favor of gun control.
Right.
And it was really interesting to me that they felt organized, and they felt fairly scripted.
Absolutely.
And they got a lot of national media coverage. But what didn't get a lot of coverage and what didn't feel scripted was around the country there were a few walkouts by students in favor of gun rights.
Quite a few.
And it certainly feels like one got more mainstream media attention than the other. You agree?
I absolutely agree. The mainstream media has an ideology and an agenda to push a certain narrative, and and I've been cut off many times on interviews, talk shows, because of that. So they set the table in a manner of where they want this discussion to go.
All right, so let's shift gears just a little bit, because there's this big debate raging on today, and it's what do we do to stop this from happening in the future, or at least to diminish the impact, right? And so one side says, well, we need gun control. We need to keep guns out of the hands of certain people, which, by the way, certain people, we do need to come up with a way to figure out how to keep guns out of the hands of people who are mentally ill and who are a threat.
Yeah.
The other one is, no, actually, what might be a real good idea is to have armed and trained school staff, right? And so what people don't seem to understand, and so you don't necessarily, that debate's actually already been settled, because in Colorado, you can already have armed school staff, right? So school districts can designate someone who wants to volunteer to carry concealed in the school. And so this is already happening. We don't know to what extent necessarily. We do know there's school districts doing it. But what we should be able to agree on is that those people should be trained and be competent in the use of that gun. And that's where FASTER comes in. And I know that you were introduced to me by Laura Carno, who was running this FASTER training here in Colorado. And FASTER is essentially training school staff to not just engage an active shooter with a gun, but also things like triage, how to stop bleeding, you know, to try and stop the carnage from advancing too rapidly. Because oftentimes it takes a while for law enforcement to get there. So it's actually going to be a school staff, and this doesn't necessarily mean teachers. This could be a janitor, it could be an administrator, right? And so you're supportive of this idea.
Absolutely. FASTER in Colorado is a great organization. Laura's doing amazing work, and it is the solution to stopping school shootings the fastest way possible. You look at Parkland, they had a law enforcement, school resource officer there who didn't act. That's one thing that happens is if you have one, they can become a target, or they can, not act. So having multiple people to confront an active shooter is one of the quickest ways to save lives, and people, this is the sickening part about this topic is a lot of the gun control advocates are holding this topic hostage, where they won't even discuss the fact that we need to stop these, physically stop them when they start, and protect lives. And they try and push their agenda, because they know if they can't get their agenda accomplished before they stop these school shootings, then it doesn't have the emotional impact. And I think that's one thing that surprises me that we can't come together on, is to physically stop these threats as they arise.
Right. Look, just a couple minutes left.
Yeah.
One of the things I want to talk about is there's this tremendous human ability to overcome adversity. And you obviously went through a pretty significant trauma at a young age. But you got your head screwed on straight.
Well,
You've been we hope. Seems to me. But talk to me about that process. How did you go from the killers basically having to talk two killers out of murdering you to where you're sitting today? How'd that happen?
Well, one, my faith is one. I'm very blessed, and I'm very grateful to be alive. I had tons of support from family, friends, my football team during the school, and really looking at life and understanding. There's been a lot of turning points, and one of those was when I saw a Holocaust survivor speak, and she was this old Jewish woman who told a story of how she lived in sewers and in people's basements, and the things she saw, and the depravity of what what happened during the Holocaust, and for years endured this hardship. And I just looked at her and thought, if this little Jewish woman can make it through it, I gotta, I'm gonna pull through this, and it was just putting things in perspective, and looking at the value of life, and knowing that life goes on and things do get better. It's not if you're above ground, you're still here for a reason, I believe. So, I just keep chugging along and doing what I can to make things a better world.
All right, Evan, thanks. Hey, man, really appreciate you coming and talking to us today. Check us out at independenceinstitute.org, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Thanks, man.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Yeah.